In this last problem, we have a lot going on. So let's go one step at a time. We have the unit circle. So here I've drawn our unit circle. I know the unit circle is centered at the origin with a radius of 1, which means that's the equation. And if that's the equation, then here's my parametric equation with h equals 0, k equals 0, and then a and b both equal to 1. So I have x equals cosine of t, y equals sine of t from 0 to 2 pi. Now, remember the note that this automatically gives us a counterclockwise rotation. So let's read through what adjustments we want to make. We want to orient this to go clockwise. So we need to change the orientation at some point. And I want t equals 0 my first time to correspond to 0, -1. Because normally 0 to pi starts right here and then goes around. That's our unit circle. But I actually want to have my starting point to be here. Want to start here. And I want to go around this way, clockwise instead of counterclockwise. So we actually have 3 adjustments that we're going to make here. Our first adjustment is we want to change the starting point from t equals 0 to t equals -pi/2. I want to start down here. So instead of from 0 to pi, I want to start here and go around. That one is actually a pretty easy adjustment to make. All we're going to do is instead of from 0 to pi, I'm going to go from -pi/2 to 3pi/2. Because that's still the full unit circle. I'm just starting down here now. So I'm starting from -pi/2 and I'm going all the way around to a +3pi/2. And that still gets me the whole circle. Now let's deal with our orientation. We want this to go clockwise. So I need to reverse the orientation. So remember, that means to replace all the t's with negative t's, including in your parameters. I'm going to erase this, move it over. There we go. So I'm going to replace all the t's with negative t's and divide even my parameters by -1. And hey, look at that. These are our even-odd identities. So I know cosine of -t is just going to be cosine of t. And I know sine of -t is going to be negative sine of t. Those even-odd identities. And this is now going to be +pi/2, -3pi/2. But I still want to go from smallest, -3pi/2, to largest, +pi/2. And that right there is going to start at this point and reverse our orientation, so we're going clockwise. Now, we do have one last thing we want to do, because it says it wants us to start at t equals 0. And you'll notice right now, we're not starting at t equals 0. We're starting at t equals -3pi/2. So the last thing I need to do is shift my parameter ahead 3pi/2 units. If I shift this ahead 3pi/2, then it will start at 0, which is what I want, t to start at 0. Now remember, to shift my parameter ahead, I'm going to do t minus 3pi/2. Replace all my t's with t minus 3pi/2, and that will shift it ahead. And that will shift these ones ahead 3 pi halves. So let's see what we got here. This right here, I can use my addition and subtraction identities. So that's cosine changes the silly sign. And then same thing with sine. Sine can't change signs. There's our addition and subtractions. And this is now going to be from 0 to 2 pi when I add that in. Now, I know cosine of 3 pi halves is 0. Sine of 3 pi halves is -1. So this is 0. This is -1. So that is going to give me x equals negative sine of t, because this all goes away because it's times by 0. This becomes a -1, so negative sine of t. And a y equals negative cosine of t, because this goes away because it's a 0. And this is a negative. Ooh, I messed that up big time. Let me try that again, guys. Hello, sine of 3 pi halves is -1. So this goes away because that's 0. We've got a negative times a -1, which gives me a positive cosine. But then I still have this negative out in front, which gives me a negative cosine. And that is our final answer. So if you made a t-table for that, it would be the unit circle. It would start down here at t equals 0, and it would go in a clockwise direction, which is what I want. It's kind of a good summary of all the different adjustments we learned how to do. So that is it. That is your final example for 1060. You are officially done with all things 1060. You are done with the last lesson, 8.2, in the last chapter, chapter 8. You can now get started on your homework. Congratulations.